The rain drummed against the conference room windows as Sarah Martinez watched her colleagues file out after another heated board meeting. 6 months ago, she would have been the one trailing behind, her voice cracking as she tried to defend her proposals, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. Today, she remained seated, her expression neutral, her breathing steady. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but the results were undeniable. Respect had replaced the patronizing smiles, and her voice now carried weight in rooms where it had once been dismissed. The journey to emotional detachment had begun on a particularly brutal Tuesday in March. Sarah had presented what she believed was a groundbreaking marketing strategy to the executive team, only to watch as her ideas were systematically torn apart by colleagues who seemed more interested in demonstrating their intellectual superiority than in finding solutions. The final blow came when James, the senior vice president, had leaned back in his chair and said with a condescending smile, "Sarah, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but perhaps we should leave the strategic thinking to those with more experience." That night, Sarah had driven home in a haze of humiliation and rage. She'd called her sister, tears streaming down her face as she recounted the day's events. But, somewhere between the third tissue and her sister's well-meaning advice to just ignore them, a different thought had crystallized. What if the problem wasn't their cruelty? What if it was her reaction to it? What if vulnerability, which she'd always considered a strength, was actually her greatest weakness in the corporate arena? The concept of emotional coldness often carries negative connotations, conjuring images of heartless individuals who manipulate others without remorse. But there exists a more nuanced form of emotional detachment, one that serves as both armor and weapon in a world that often mistakes kindness for weakness. This strategic emotional distance isn't about becoming cruel or callous, it's about developing the ability to separate one's emotional responses from one's decision-making processes, creating a psychological barrier that protects while simultaneously commanding respect. Dr. Marcus Chen had written extensively about this phenomenon in his research on workplace dynamics. His studies showed that individuals who maintained what he termed professional emotional neutrality were consistently rated as more competent, trustworthy, and leadership-worthy by their peers and superiors. The data was compelling. People who reacted less emotionally to criticism, setbacks, and interpersonal conflicts were more likely to be promoted, more likely to have their ideas taken seriously, and more likely to be consulted during critical decision-making processes. Sarah discovered Dr. Chen's work during her research into communication strategies. What struck her most wasn't the academic jargon or the statistical analyses, it was the case study of Elena Vasquez, a software engineer who had transformed her career by learning to manage her emotional responses. Elena had gone from being overlooked and underestimated to becoming the youngest department head in her company's history, not by changing her technical skills, but by changing how she presented herself emotionally. The first principle of strategic emotional coldness is the separation of self-worth from external validation. Most people, Sarah realized, operate like emotional weather vanes, their internal state shifting based on every comment, every facial expression, every perceived slight or praise from others. This constant reactivity not only creates unnecessary suffering but also signals to others that one's emotional state can be easily manipulated. When colleagues can predict exactly how someone will react to criticism or praise, that person loses a significant amount of psychological leverage. Sarah began practicing this separation through what she called observer mode. Instead of immediately reacting when someone challenged her ideas or made dismissive comments, she would mentally step back and watch the interaction as if she were a neutral third party. The first time she tried this technique was during a team meeting where a colleague interrupted her mid-sentence to say, "I think what Sarah is trying to say is." Her old self would have felt a surge of anger and either shrunk back or launched into a defensive explanation. Instead, she paused, observed the interruption with clinical interest, and said calmly, "Actually, what I'm saying is quite different. Let me finish, and then you can share your thoughts." The room had gone quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence that follows an emotional outburst, but the respectful quiet that emerges when someone demonstrates unexpected composure. Her colleague had actually apologized, and, more importantly, no one interrupted her for the remainder of the meeting. The second principle involves the strategic display of indifference to outcomes that would typically trigger strong emotional responses. This doesn't mean becoming apathetic about results or goals, but rather developing the ability to appear unaffected by setbacks, criticisms, or even successes. When people cannot easily read one's emotional state, they tend to attribute greater depth and stability to that person's character. Sarah learned this lesson during a project that she had spent months developing. When the client ultimately chose a competitor's proposal, her team members looked to her for a reaction. 6 months earlier, she would have either put on a fake smile while dying inside or expressed her disappointment openly. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "That's their decision. Let's analyze what we can learn from this and apply it to the next proposal." Her team members later told her that her calm response had been more reassuring than any pep talk could have been. The cultivation of emotional coldness requires a fundamental shift in how one views interpersonal interactions. Rather than seeing conversations as opportunities to be liked or validated, they become chess games where every move serves a strategic purpose. This doesn't mean becoming manipulative or deceptive, but rather approaching interactions with clear objectives and maintaining emotional distance from the outcomes. Marcus Thompson had mastered this approach during his rise from junior analyst to investment firm partner. In an industry where emotional reactions could cost millions of dollars, Marcus had learned to view every interaction through the lens of strategic advantage. When clients became emotional about losses, Marcus remained calm and focused on solutions. When colleagues tried to provoke him during high-stress negotiations, he responded with measured professionalism. This consistency had earned him a reputation as someone who could be trusted in crisis situations, a reputation that had directly contributed to his rapid advancement. The practice of emotional coldness also involves reframing rejection and criticism as data rather than personal attacks. When someone dismisses an idea, the emotionally detached individual doesn't interpret this as a reflection of their worth or competence, but rather as information about the other person's preferences, biases, or motivations. This reframing allows for more objective analysis and strategic response rather than emotional reaction. Sarah discovered the power of this approach during a particularly challenging interaction with her company's CEO. During a presentation, he had stopped her halfway through and said, "This isn't what we discussed. I thought you understood our direction better than this." Her old self would have felt crushed and scrambled to apologize or explain. Instead, she paused, processed his feedback as information, and responded, "I'd like to understand where the disconnect is. Can you help me identify the specific areas where this deviates from your vision?" The conversation that followed was productive rather than defensive, and the CEO later commended her for her professionalism under pressure. The development of strategic emotional coldness often requires confronting one's deeply held beliefs about relationships and human interaction. Many people operate under the assumption that showing emotion demonstrates authenticity and builds connection. While this may be true in personal relationships, professional environments often operate by different rules. The person who remains composed under pressure is more likely to be entrusted with additional responsibilities, included in important decisions, and viewed as leadership material. This reality can be particularly challenging for individuals who have been socialized to value emotional expressiveness and empathy above all else. The transition requires recognizing that different contexts demand different approaches, and that the skills that serve one well in personal relationships may actually hinder professional advancement. Lisa Wong had struggled with this transition during her early years as an emergency room physician. Her natural empathy and emotional responsiveness had initially seemed like assets in a profession dedicated to helping others. However, she soon realized that her emotional reactions to patient deaths and traumatic cases were not only affecting her own well-being but also undermining her colleagues' confidence in her ability to handle high-pressure situations. Through deliberate practice, she learned to compartmentalize her emotional responses, maintaining compassion for patients while presenting a calm, competent exterior to her medical team. This transformation had been instrumental in her selection as chief resident and, later, as department head. The mastery of emotional coldness also involves learning to use silence as a tool rather than feeling compelled to fill every pause with words. When people become uncomfortable with silence, they often reveal more than they intend to, providing valuable information about their motivations, insecurities, and decision-making processes. The person who remains comfortable with quiet moments holds a significant advantage in negotiations, confrontations, and strategic discussions. David Park had learned this lesson during his years as a defense attorney. Early in his career, he had felt the need to immediately respond to every accusation, every piece of evidence presented by the prosecution. This reactive approach had made him appear defensive and had often led him to reveal weaknesses in his own case. Through experience, he learned that strategic silence could be far more powerful than immediate response. By pausing, allowing tension to build, and then responding with calculated precision, he was able to control the rhythm of proceedings and force opponents to reveal their strategies prematurely. The practice of emotional detachment also extends to how one handles success and praise. While it may seem counterintuitive, maintaining the same level of composure when receiving positive feedback as when receiving criticism creates an aura of stability and self-assurance that others find compelling. People who react dramatically to praise appear needy and insecure, while those who accept it with quiet confidence seem more deserving of additional recognition. Sarah had experienced this phenomenon during her first major presentation after beginning her transformation. The presentation had gone exceptionally well, with several senior executives offering enthusiastic praise for her work. Instead of beaming with obvious pleasure or expressing effusive gratitude, she had simply said, "Thank you. I'm glad the analysis was helpful," and then had moved on to discuss next steps. Later, her manager had commented that her composed response to praise had been very professional and had suggested she was ready for greater responsibilities. The cultivation of strategic emotional coldness requires ongoing self-monitoring and adjustment. It's not about suppressing all emotions, but rather about choosing when and how to display them for maximum impact. A carefully timed show of passion can be far more effective than constant emotional reactivity, precisely because it contrasts with one's typical composed demeanor. The process also involves developing what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe one's own thought processes and emotional responses as they occur. This skill allows individuals to recognize when they're beginning to react emotionally and to make conscious choices about how to proceed. Rather than being swept away by immediate feelings, they can pause, assess the strategic implications of various responses, and choose the most advantageous course of action. Dr. Patricia Williams, a negotiations expert, had built her career on this foundation. During high-stakes business negotiations, she had learned to monitor her emotional responses in real time, recognizing when opponents were trying to provoke reactions that would give them advantages. By maintaining awareness of her internal state while appearing completely calm externally, she had been able to secure favorable deals that more reactive negotiators might have lost through emotional responses. The journey toward emotional coldness also involves redefining success metrics. Instead of measuring progress through immediate emotional satisfaction or the approval of others, the focus shifts to longer-term strategic outcomes. This perspective allows individuals to endure short-term discomfort or disapproval in service of larger goals, creating a foundation for sustained achievement rather than momentary validation. This shift had been crucial for Robert Chen during his transition from employee to entrepreneur. His natural inclination had been to seek approval and avoid conflict, traits that had served him well as a team member but were proving detrimental as a business owner. Learning to make unpopular decisions without being derailed by others' negative reactions had been essential to his company's survival during its difficult early years. The ability to remain focused on business outcomes rather than emotional responses had ultimately enabled him to build a successful organization that employed dozens of people. The development of emotional coldness also requires understanding the difference between being cold and being cruel. Strategic emotional detachment involves maintaining professional composure and making decisions based on logic rather than emotion, but it doesn't require abandoning basic human decency or treating others poorly. The goal is to become less reactive, not less ethical. This distinction had been important for Jennifer Martinez during her tenure as a middle manager in a retail company. When she had to implement layoffs during a corporate restructuring, her emotional detachment had allowed her to focus on making decisions based on performance data and business needs rather than personal relationships. However, she had still delivered the news with compassion and had worked to help affected employees find new opportunities. The combination of clear decision-making and humane execution had earned her respect from both senior management and her team members. The practice of strategic emotional coldness also involves learning to separate one's identity from one's role or performance in any given situation. People who define themselves primarily through their work achievements or others' opinions become vulnerable to emotional manipulation and tend to make decisions based on ego rather than strategy. Those who maintain a strong sense of self independent of external circumstances can navigate challenges more effectively because they're not defending their entire identity with every decision. This separation had been vital for Dr. Amanda Foster during her years as a research scientist. In a field where criticism of one's work could feel like personal attacks, she had learned to view peer review and criticism as part of a process rather than judgments on her worth as a person. This perspective had allowed her to incorporate feedback objectively and to pursue research directions based on scientific merit rather than emotional attachment to particular theories or approaches. The cultivation of emotional detachment also involves developing comfort with being misunderstood or disliked by some people. The desire for universal approval often leads to compromised decision-making and inconsistent behavior. Those who accept that not everyone will appreciate their approach can maintain consistency in their actions and communications, creating predictability that others find valuable in professional settings. Mark Rodriguez had learned this lesson during his years as a project manager in the construction industry. His commitment to deadlines and quality standards had sometimes put him at odds with subcontractors who preferred more flexible timelines. Early in his career, the tension had bothered him, leading him to compromise standards in order to maintain relationships. However, he had eventually realized that his reliability and high standards were more valuable than universal popularity. Contractors might not always like his decisions, but they respected his consistency and sought him out for important projects because they knew he would deliver results. The strategic use of emotional coldness also extends to how one handles personal attacks or attempts at intimidation. Rather than responding emotionally to provocations, the emotionally detached individual can recognize these tactics for what they are: attempts to destabilize one's thinking and decision-making capabilities. By remaining calm and focused on substantive issues, they can often turn attempted attacks into advantages by highlighting the other party's unprofessional behavior. Sarah had experienced this dynamic during a particularly contentious meeting where a colleague had made several personal comments clearly designed to provoke an emotional reaction. Instead of taking the bait, she had remained focused on the business issues at hand, responding to each attack with calm redirection to the topic. By the end of the meeting, the colleague's behavior had become obviously inappropriate to everyone present, while Sarah's professionalism had been highlighted by contrast. The journey toward emotional coldness also involves developing alternative sources of emotional fulfillment outside of work. When professional interactions become less emotionally charged, it becomes important to have other areas of life where emotional expression and connection are appropriate and valued. This balance prevents the development of genuine coldness while maintaining professional effectiveness. For Sarah, this balance had come through deepening her relationships with family and close friends. By saving her emotional investment for people and situations where it was truly welcomed and reciprocated, she had been able to maintain her humanity while developing professional armor. Her sister had noticed that while Sarah seemed more distant at work, she was actually more present and engaged during their personal conversations. The mastery of strategic emotional detachment also requires understanding when to selectively reveal emotion for maximum impact. A person who never shows any emotional response may seem robotic or disconnected. However, someone who typically maintains composure but occasionally displays controlled passion or concern can create powerful moments that command attention and respect. This selective revelation had become one of David Park's most effective courtroom techniques. After establishing a reputation for calm professionalism, his rare moments of visible passion during closing arguments became dramatically more impactful. Jurors paid attention when someone who usually remained composed became animated about an issue, interpreting his emotion as a signal that the matter was truly important. The development of emotional coldness also involves learning to view conflict as a tool rather than something to be avoided at all costs. Many people expend enormous energy trying to prevent or smooth over conflicts, often at the expense of important principles or outcomes. Those who can remain emotionally detached during disagreements can engage in conflict strategically, using it to clarify positions, establish boundaries, and achieve better results. This approach had been crucial for Lisa Wong during her transition to department leadership. As an emergency room physician, she had initially tried to avoid conflicts with senior staff members, even when their decisions seemed medically questionable. Learning to engage in professional disagreement without becoming emotionally invested in being liked had allowed her to advocate more effectively for patient care while establishing herself as a strong leader. The practice of emotional coldness also involves developing patience as a strategic weapon. In a world where most people expect immediate responses and quick resolutions, the ability to wait and observe can provide significant advantages. Patient individuals can gather more information, allow others to reveal their motivations, and choose optimal timing for their own actions. Marcus Thompson had used this patience to great effect during investment negotiations. While other analysts felt pressure to make quick recommendations, Marcus had learned to take time for thorough analysis, even when clients expressed impatience. His willingness to delay gratification and endure temporary discomfort had consistently led to better investment decisions and had built his reputation as someone who could be trusted with long-term financial planning. The strategic application of emotional detachment also extends to how one handles praise and recognition. Rather than becoming attached to positive feedback or using it as the primary measure of progress, emotionally cold individuals can appreciate recognition while remaining focused on objective performance metrics and long-term goals. This approach prevents the emotional roller coaster that comes from depending on others' opinions for self-worth. Jennifer Martinez had learned this lesson during her rise through retail management. Early in her career, a particularly positive performance review had made her so happy that she had become complacent, while a later negative review had devastated her confidence. Through practice, she had learned to receive both praise and criticism as information rather than judgments, allowing her to maintain consistent performance regardless of the feedback cycle. The cultivation of emotional coldness also requires developing comfort with uncertainty and ambiguity. Many emotional reactions stem from the discomfort of not knowing outcomes or not being able to control all variables in a situation. Those who can remain calm in uncertain circumstances often make better decisions because they're not rushing to resolve anxiety through premature action. Dr. Amanda Foster had applied this principle throughout her research career. Scientific research inherently involves long periods of uncertainty, with no guarantee that experiments will yield useful results. By developing comfort with not knowing outcomes, she had been able to pursue longer-term research projects that less patient scientists had abandoned, ultimately leading to breakthrough discoveries that had established her reputation in the field. The journey toward strategic emotional coldness also involves learning to separate process from outcome. Many people become emotionally invested in specific results and lose objectivity when their preferred outcomes become threatened. Those who can focus on executing excellent processes while remaining detached from specific results often achieve better outcomes because they can adapt their approaches based on new information rather than emotional attachment to original plans. This flexibility had been essential for Robert Chen during his entrepreneurial journey. His original business plan had been based on assumptions that proved incorrect within the first year of operation. His ability to remain emotionally detached from the original vision had allowed him to pivot quickly to a more viable approach, while other entrepreneurs who became emotionally attached to their initial plans had struggled to adapt to market realities. The mastery of emotional coldness also involves understanding the power of controlled vulnerability. While general emotional detachment creates respect and authority, carefully chosen moments of openness can create powerful connections and influence. The key is ensuring that any emotional display is strategic rather than reactive, serving specific purposes rather than simply expressing immediate feelings. Sarah had discovered this technique during a presentation to the board of directors. After delivering her analysis with typical composure, she had concluded by saying, "I believe strongly in this recommendation, and I'm willing to stake my reputation on its success." The controlled display of commitment and vulnerability had been far more impactful than if she had simply presented the data without personal investment. The development of strategic emotional detachment also requires understanding how to manage relationships with people who interpret emotional coldness as rejection or hostility. Some individuals, particularly those who define relationships through emotional exchange, may struggle with interactions with emotionally detached people. Learning to provide enough warmth to maintain functional relationships while preserving professional boundaries becomes an important skill. This balance had been crucial for Dr. Patricia Williams in her work with clients who expected more emotional engagement from their advisors. She had learned to provide appropriate levels of personal attention and empathy while maintaining the professional distance necessary for objective advice. Her clients appreciated her caring approach while respecting her expertise precisely because she didn't become emotionally entangled in their decisions. The practice of emotional coldness also involves developing systems and routines that support consistent performance regardless of mood or external circumstances. When decision-making becomes less dependent on emotional states, having reliable processes becomes crucial for maintaining effectiveness during both good times and challenging periods. Mark Rodriguez had implemented this approach through detailed project management systems that didn't depend on his personal motivation or enthusiasm. By creating processes that could be executed regardless of his emotional state, he had been able to maintain consistent performance even during periods of personal difficulty or professional stress. This reliability had become one of his most valued professional characteristics. The strategic use of emotional detachment also extends to how one handles setbacks and failures. Rather than becoming devastated by negative outcomes or defensive about mistakes, emotionally cold individuals can analyze failures objectively and extract valuable lessons without the interference of ego or shame. This approach leads to faster learning and better long-term performance. Lisa Wong had applied this principle throughout her medical training and career. In a field where mistakes can have serious consequences, her ability to analyze her errors objectively without becoming emotionally overwhelmed had been crucial for her development as a physician. Colleagues and supervisors had come to value her willingness to discuss cases honestly and learn from difficult experiences. The cultivation of emotional coldness also involves learning to use timing as a strategic element in communications and decision-making. Understanding when to speak, when to remain silent, when to act, and when to wait can dramatically influence outcomes. This timing often depends more on strategic considerations than on immediate emotional impulses. David Park had mastered this element during his legal career. His understanding of courtroom dynamics had taught him that the impact of a statement or question often depended more on timing than on content. By remaining emotionally detached from the desire for immediate gratification, he could wait for optimal moments to make his most important points. The development of strategic emotional detachment ultimately creates a foundation for sustained success and influence that goes beyond immediate achievements. By building a reputation for reliability, objectivity, and composure, individuals create long-term advantages that compound over time. People seek out those who remain steady during turbulent times, creating opportunities for leadership and advancement that might not be available to more reactive individuals. As Sarah reflected on her transformation 6 months later, she recognized that the change had been about more than just professional advancement. The skills she had developed had improved her overall quality of life by reducing the emotional turbulence that had once dominated her daily experience. She still felt emotions, but she had learned to choose which ones deserved her attention and energy. The meeting that had triggered her journey seemed like a lifetime ago. James, the senior vice president who had dismissed her ideas so condescendingly, had recently approached her for advice on a strategic initiative. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she had responded with the same professional courtesy she showed everyone. Her emotional investment in past slights had been replaced by focus on current opportunities. The respect she had earned hadn't come at the cost of her humanity, as she had initially feared. Instead, it had come from learning to express her humanity more strategically, saving her emotional energy for situations where it could make a real difference. Her colleagues now sought her input during crises because they knew she could think clearly under pressure. Her team members trusted her leadership because they knew her decisions were based on objective analysis rather than personal mood. The journey toward emotional coldness had taught her that respect wasn't earned through vulnerability or emotional availability, but through consistent demonstration of competence, reliability, and composure. The corporate world, she had learned, operated more like a chess game than a support group. Understanding and accepting these rules hadn't made her cynical, it had made her more effective. The transformation had also revealed the extent to which her previous emotional reactivity had been limiting her potential. When every criticism felt like a personal attack and every setback felt like a reflection of her worth, her capacity for risk-taking and innovation had been severely constrained. The emotional buffer she had developed now allowed her to pursue ambitious projects and advocate for bold ideas without being paralyzed by fear of negative reactions. Dr. Chen's research had proven accurate. Professional emotional neutrality had indeed led to increased respect and advancement opportunities. But the benefits had extended beyond career success to include improved personal relationships and greater overall life satisfaction. By choosing when and where to invest her emotional energy, Sarah had found that her emotions had become more powerful and meaningful rather than less. The path toward strategic emotional coldness had required confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature and professional dynamics. It had required accepting that good intentions and hard work, while necessary, were not sufficient for success in competitive environments. It had required learning to play by rules that sometimes seemed unfair or counterintuitive. But the results spoke for themselves. Sarah's ideas were now heard and implemented. Her input was sought during important decisions. Her calm presence during crises had become a valued asset to her organization. The respect she had always wanted hadn't come from being liked or from emotional connection, but from demonstrating consistent competence and unflappable professionalism. The irony was that by learning to care less about immediate emotional responses, she had become more effective at achieving outcomes she truly cared about. The strategic distance she maintained in professional interactions had given her more power to influence positive changes and advance important initiatives. Her emotional coldness had become, paradoxically, a tool for creating the kind of impact that mattered most to her. As she prepared for another board presentation, Sarah felt none of the anxiety that would have consumed her months earlier. She had her data, her analysis, and her recommendations. Whether they accepted or rejected her proposals was beyond her control, and either outcome would simply provide information for her next strategic move. The emotional roller coaster that had once defined her professional experience had been replaced by steady, purposeful momentum toward goals that extended far beyond any single meeting or interaction. The transformation was complete, but the journey continued. Each day brought new opportunities to apply the principles she had learned, to refine her approach, and to demonstrate the power of strategic emotional detachment. The respect she had earned was not an endpoint but a foundation for even greater influence and impact in the future. The rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight now streamed through the conference room windows. Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to return to work, her expression calm and focused. The emotional storms that had once battered her professional life had given way to a climate of steady progress and growing influence. She had learned to command respect not through warmth or vulnerability, but through the quiet power of strategic emotional coldness, and the results had exceeded even her most ambitious expectations. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.